Why Indonesia has over 17,000 islands. Let's discuss from the perspectives of geology, history, and impact on culture. Why does it have so many? What caused this extreme fragmentation of land? And how has it shaped the lives, culture, and identity of the people who live here? To understand this, we need to look far back in time to the shifting of Earth's tectonic plates. Indonesia sits right on the edge of several major plates. The Indo-Australian plate is pushing northward. The Eurasian plate is pushing south, and the Pacific plate is moving west. Many of Indonesia's islands were once connected by land. During the last ice age, sea levels were much lower. But when the glaciers melted and sea levels rose, those land bridges disappeared. As molten rock cooled and hardened above sea level, it created land. In fact, it's part of the Pacific Ring of Fire, one of the most seismically active zones on the planet. Over millions of years, these volcanic eruptions formed chains of islands. The result is the world's largest archipelagic state. But with that fragmentation came something else. Incredible diversity. Each island developed with its own environment, challenges, and connections to other regions, and over thousands of years, people adapted in different ways. That's how islands like Java, Sumatra, Bali, and parts of Nusa Tenggara were born. From an anthropological perspective, this isolation led to deep cultural variation. But that's not the only reason Indonesia is so fragmented. Indonesia is home to more than 700 languages. That's not dialects, actual, distinct languages. The Austronesian peoples were among the first to settle these islands. They were expert sailors, navigating across the seas using the stars, ocean swells, and wind. The Austronesian peoples were among the first to settle the islands of what is now Indonesia, and they played a massive role in shaping the cultural foundation of the region. Around 4000 to 2000 BCE, these early seafarers began migrating from what is today Taiwan, spreading southward through the Philippines, then further into Indonesia, and eventually as far west as Madagascar and as far east as Hawaii and Easter Island. That's one of the largest and fastest human migrations in pre-modern history, all done without modern navigation tools. What made the Austronesians unique was their mastery of the sea. They developed double-hulled canoes, outriggers, and sailing techniques that allowed them to cross thousands of kilometers of open ocean with incredible accuracy. They navigated using the stars, ocean swells, bird flight patterns, and cloud formations. When they reached the Indonesian archipelago, they didn't just pass through. They settled, farmed, and adapted to island life. They brought with them agricultural knowledge, including the cultivation of rice, bananas, yams, coconuts, and taro. They also brought domesticated animals, pottery techniques, and even language. The roots of many Indonesian languages today, including Bahasa Indonesia, trace back to the Austronesian language family. Culturally, they introduced animistic beliefs, ancestor worship, and maritime rituals, many of which still influence local customs in places like Balai. So what's important to remember is that before modern national boundaries, before major religions arrived, and long before colonization, the Austronesians laid the foundation for island life in Indonesia. Not as one people, but as a network of island communities tied together by boats, trade, and the ocean. Even though the Austronesians began migrating thousands of years ago, their influence is still deeply embedded in daily life across Indonesia today, in ways many people don't even realize. First, the most obvious legacy is language. Most of the local languages spoken in Indonesia, from Javanese to Balinese to Bugis, and even Indonesia itself, are part of the Austronesian language family. The structure, vocabulary, and even the way people count or name family members are all rooted in that ancient linguistic foundation. Second, you see Austronesian influence in architecture and village layout. Traditional houses in places like Toraja, Nios, and Flores are built on stilts, have elevated wooden structures, and are oriented toward nature and ancestors, a reflection of Austronesian animistic and ancestral beliefs. Third, agriculture and food. Many of the staple crops in Indonesia today, like rice, bananas, coconuts, and taro, were spread by Austronesian migrants. Farming techniques, like rice terrace systems, show how early settlers adapted to Indonesia's mountainous and island terrain. Fourth, social structure and kinship systems. Some Indonesian ethnic groups, like the Minangkabau in West Sumatra, still follow a matrilineal system. Something rare in the world, but consistent with Austronesian kinship, the strong emphasis on extended family, ancestral worship, and community ceremonies in Indonesia also ties back to Austronesian tradition. Fifth, and maybe most fascinating, is the maritime culture. Indonesia's relationship with the sea, from fishing practices to traditional boat building, comes straight from its Austronesian roots. In parts of eastern Indonesia, like the Maluku Islands or the Bajau communities, people still use boats that look almost identical to those used 2,000 years ago. The sea is not just for transport. It's spiritual, practical, and central to identity. Even music and dance traditions reflect Austronesian influence, especially the use of oral storytelling, rhythmic percussion, and body movement to preserve and pass down history. Indonesia is home to thousands of temples, mosques, and churches, and more than 700 languages are spoken across its 17,000 islands. This extraordinary cultural and religious diversity is not accidental. It is the result of centuries of interaction with various civilizations from Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. One of the earliest and most influential contacts came from India as early as 1,500 years ago. Indian traders and monks arrived in the Indonesian archipelago, introducing Hinduism, Buddhism, Sanskrit, and ideas related to kingship, cosmology, and architecture. These influences were not imposed through conquest, but were gradually adopted and reinterpreted by local communities. This cultural exchange led to the construction of monumental temples such as Borobudur in central Java and Prambanan near Yogyakarta. The linguistic legacy of India also remains strong, with many modern Indonesian words derived from Sanskrit, including terms like Bahasa and Raja. Trade with China also played a significant role in shaping Indonesian culture. Chinese merchants brought goods such as ceramics, silk, and tea, and many settled in trading ports like Medan and Jakarta. Over time, these Chinese communities integrated with local societies, resulting in a unique hybrid known as the Peranakan culture. This fusion is evident in language, cuisine, architecture, and traditional clothing that combine both Chinese and Indonesian elements. From the 13th century onward, Arab and Persian traders began arriving in greater numbers, bringing Islam to the islands. Rather than spreading through conquest, Islam took root gradually through trade, intermarriage, and local adaptation. Many local rulers and scholars embraced Islamic teachings, while continuing to observe traditional cultural practices. One of the clearest examples of this cultural synthesis can be seen in the continued use of wayang kulit, or Javanese shadow puppetry, to tell Islamic stories. The spread of Islam was also guided by respected religious figures such as the Wali Songo, a group of 9 scholars who helped establish a distinctly Indonesian form of Islam that combined faith, art, and community values. In the 16th century, European powers began arriving in search of spices. The Portuguese were the first to establish a presence, followed by the Dutch and, briefly, the British. Among these, the Dutch maintained control the longest, ruling large parts of the archipelago for over 3 centuries. During this time, they introduced Western legal systems, Christian missionary work, infrastructure projects, and formal education. In regions such as Flores and East Nusa Tenggara, the Portuguese legacy remains particularly strong, reflected in the presence of Catholic churches and Portuguese family names that have been passed down for generations. During World War II, Indonesia experienced another period of foreign occupation, this time by the Japanese. Although the Japanese occupation lasted only 3 years, it had a lasting impact. The Japanese dismantled Dutch colonial institutions and promoted the idea of Asian solidarity, though often through authoritarian means. At the same time, their presence unintentionally accelerated the development of nationalist movements. On August 17, 1945, just 2 days after Japan's surrender, Indonesia declared its independence. Today, the culture of Indonesia reflects this complex and layered history. It is not the product of a single tradition or external influence, but rather a rich combination of indigenous Austronesian roots and contributions from Indian, Chinese, Arab, European, and Japanese civilizations. From an anthropological perspective, Indonesia is a powerful example of cultural transformation. Traditions were not erased by foreign contact. Instead, they were adapted, reshaped, and woven into new cultural forms. This helps explain why Balani's Hindu rituals differ so greatly from Islamic ceremonies in Ossetian, or why Batak music in North Sumatra contrasts with the gamelan traditions of Java. Even today, Christian and Islamic holidays are often observed alongside long-standing local customs such as Ingoban, the Balani's cremation ritual. Indonesia's identity is defined not by uniformity, but by diversity. A diversity that has been shaped by geography, migration, trade, colonization, and resilience. It is this historical and cultural richness that makes Indonesia one of the most complex and fascinating nations in the world. Most Indonesians grow up with values like rukun, toleransi, and gotong royong. These are not just nice ideas, they're woven into daily life. People tend to avoid open conflict, prefer indirect communication, and place high importance on social stability. Sometimes, even above personal opinion, in many areas, especially outside the big cities, community expectations often outweigh individual freedom. There's a strong respect for tradition and religion, but this can cut both ways. On one hand, it creates deep-rooted communities with a strong sense of belonging. On the other, it can mean conformity and social pressure, expressing alternative lifestyles, beliefs, or identities. Especially around gender, religion, or politics, can still be met with judgment or even hostility, depending on where you are. Indonesia is also a place of growing self-confidence, especially among young people. There's a rising pride in local culture, languages, food, and art. But at the same time, there's an ongoing struggle with centralization and inequality. Jakarta often feels like a different world from places like Papua or remote islands, and Indonesians feel left out of national progress. Technology has given rise to a digitally savvy, funny, and sharp-witted younger generation, especially on platforms like TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. But internet freedom isn't always guaranteed, and online discourse is still shaped by censorship, surveillance, or political fear in certain cases. There is a strong culture of adaptation. Maybe because Indonesians are used to living with uncertainty. Volcanic eruptions, floods, corruption, economic swings. People know how to survive, make do, and adjust. But that can also lead to tolerance for dysfunction, like brushing off poor public services or quietly accepting inequality as just the way things are. If you've made it this far, thanks for watching. Let us know in the comments which Indonesian island you'd love to explore or learn more about.